I'd like first of all to thank מכון מפרשים Institute, and Yuri in particular from Shalvata for making all this happen. Yuri was very persistent, consistent, and gentle in inviting me to come here today, and I'm glad I did. These have been two very inspiring lectures so far, so thank you, Professor Lane, and thank you, Professor Shahar. And my talk today, I made it clear to Yuri I was going to talk, and I hope I can stick to it, is about vitality and presence, the koan of vitality and presence in psychoanalysis. So the presence of vitality and the vitality of presence. So this has to do with patient and therapist relationship. Now, as I think of this, I remember myself lying on the couch on a first session, analytic session. And I look at my therapist, whom I've heard quite a lot about, but I don't know. And I find something rising up within me, an emotion or a feeling that comes up, an authentic something that comes up. And I ask him, can I shout? This is the first analytic session. With a therapist I don't know. Pardon? Yeah? Okay now? Better? I'll try. With a therapist I don't know. So there's a moment's hesitation, and then he says, you can try. And it took me 5 years. Now, it took me 5 years, I think, partly because of that moment's hesitation, which had to do with his presence, which verbally was inviting. But on other levels, I found not totally authentic at that particular moment. So what we do, we is an integrative clinic which integrates psychoanalytic, humanistic, oriental medicine, and Zen. What we do is we look at people from all different aspects, endeavoring to be as present as possible, endeavoring to find their way to vitality. And what I'm describing, what I shall be describing, are the links between the two. Now, we've implemented a similar model in Ha'emek Hospital, not implemented, but we work with Ha'emek Hospital in thinking about a very similar model, which integrates in many ways, in a similar vein, I think, to what Professor Lane was describing in Germany, how people can be vital. So we're not looking specifically at pathology, but we're looking at vitality. We're thinking philosophically that to be present means that there's an I always get confused using this word, epistemological foundation to being with another person. This is the Buddhist leg of our work. We look at the ontology of the world vital, rhythms of the world, the tempo of the world, everything around us, vital. So we look at Taoism and Oriental medicine, and we look at the dynamics, psychodynamics and psychoanalysis through a very particular prism of the body. So how can we do that? How can we reinscribe consciousness or awareness of, which are different things? And awareness of an emotion is not emotional consciousness, yes? How can we reinscribe that? How can we reread that? How can we describe in words that which is not verbal, which does not reside necessarily in the verbal realm. What I'm going to invite you to do in the following half an hour or so, maybe more, is to follow with me some of the lines I and my colleagues have followed over the 25 years that we've been doing this work, looking at the interconnection between one person's presence and another person's vitality. And thinking about the consciousness that is involved with doing that. I'm making this definition because as psychologists, we tend to say things like, I feel that something. I feel that this patient, I feel that. No, we can't feel that. We can feel and think that this feeling has to do with something. So this is elusive. A few weeks ago, I sat with a patient, withdrawn, often morose, her voice often monotonous. I had a feeling in myself of turbid, heavy breathlessness. It was all too prominent, often lying heavily on me. I was just on us. Towards the end of the session, a shift occurred. She shut her eyes and said, I sense something else is happening, which I can't place. Immediately, and not typically in our sessions, I must confess, I found myself alert, alive. Something else was happening. What's happening now? I inquired, interested and engaged. Do you know your circumstances after your birth? I follow my image through that baby left alone. A week later, she confides. She asked her mother, who told her that immediately after her birth, a severe diagnosis with a poor prognosis was given them. We were told to avoid paying attention to you, she said. We were told you'd be better off like that, and that we'd be better off like that as well. What happens to consciousness in a non-verbal or pre-verbal world? How did that moan or drone come back, arise after 30 years of life and 2 years in therapy? Where did it come from? What are the categories we can inscribe or define this body-mind happening through? And how are they related to the patient-therapist interaction, to the patient's vitality, to the presence of both people in the therapy room? Wittgenstein has taught us that the limits of our world are the limits of our language. Michel Foucault, French philosopher, has taken Wittgenstein to task, I think, in his book, The Order of Things, in Hebrew, Hamilim V'Advarim, which I was fascinated by the first pages of in which he invents, literally speaking, a Chinese encyclopedia that gives categories to the animal world. Now, what Foucault does, Foucault is a deconstructive philosopher, a destructuralist philosopher. What he does is not talk about mammals or reptiles or dinosaurs or pigs, whatever. His categories are animals that are tame, sirens. This should arouse a peal of laughter. Sirens. Fabulous animals, stray dogs, animals included in the present classification, frenzied animals, animals drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, animals just having broken the water pitcher, animals that look from far away like flies. In other words, I found it ludicrous. I broke out laughing when I read this, because it breaks all customary, all definitions that we're accustomed to hearing about animals. Voloshinov, a philosopher of language, tells us this. It's possible to objectivize one's own language, one's worldview, one's linguistic habitus, only in the light of another language belonging to someone else. So the first step in outstepping our categories of thinking about body and mind would be taking from another language. The first step in thinking about these new categories of presence and vitality would be borrowing or looking from the perspective of another language. Which is why this is up there, because as you see or know, these are Japanese kanji. This is Japanese. And what it says is body, mind as one. Top is body. You can see it's heavier. Second from the top is the heart, the mind, heart, mind, shin. Then there's a line which says one, body, mind, one, and then it's a qualification saying as one. So basically, if we read Japanese, there's no interval between the two kanji, no interval between the two letters. It's all one. And we can start thinking about a world in which words are not representations, but are presentations or images, words and being, words and vitality, words and presence. The words body-mind and the images of the body-mind are not two separate things. Rather, they coexist and they create images, alive, poetic, emotionally laden with feeling. So if body and mind are one or as one, how does that apply to psychotherapy and psychoanalysis? Now, I started my PhD research reading a lot of psychoanalytic texts and finding to my amazement that what I thought was psychoanalysis was no longer psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis these days proliferates with words like the unthought known, Wallace, unformulated experience, Donald Stern. So what we tend to think of as a formulated, conceptual, word-based, definitive art is no longer so. Body and mind are defined by words such as psychosomatic, not psychosomatic, psychosomatic or somatopsychic. And Daniel Stern gives us a further lead, a further paving stone along the way, calling his scheme, Daniel Stern with the Boston group, calling his scheme having to do with vitality affects. Some years ago, I was one of the co-leaders of a pilot study we did with Hadassah Hospital's post-trauma unit. It was a period in which there was a peak in terrorist attacks here in Israel. And what Hadassah approached our clinic to do was to work together, giving psychotherapy and body work, shiatsu, Zen shiatsu, to patients, trying to see if the combination worked better than either separately. Now, what we confronted was the need to find words to define what progress would be. And what we started leaning upon was actually neuropsychoanalysis, especially Antonio Damasio's terms about feelings and emotions, mainly background feelings and background emotions, which seem to provide the common shared field of psychotherapy and bodywork. So Damasio tells us about energy, about excitement, about wellness, sickness, tension, relaxation, not as terminology, but rather as feeling, as experience. So we're not talking about emotions as in object relations that are directed towards an object. It's not envy of or anger at. It's what we perceive within ourselves, or don't perceive, as some of the patients you've described, what we perceive in ourselves to be dragging, surging, a feeling of stability, a feeling of instability, which in some ways we often go around when we try to think psychoanalytically. What do you feel? I feel a dragging feeling, but what's the emotion? Oh, maybe it's sadness, maybe it's depression, but it's not. The real, the true self, the real self, has to do with feelings, not with emotions directed at. So this brings us to a new construal of self-states or ego states in terms of body-mind feelings, not necessarily of relationships. They later configure relationships and enter into relationships. But we enter self-states from a different vantage point. So we can look at this intrapsychically, on formulated experiences, feelings, and we could look at this on different terms. We can look at it through relationships, interpsychically. Do I have license from my analyst to shout? Is there a feeling of at-one-ment, Björn would say, of fusion or interpenetration, Marion Milner and Winnicott would say? Or in this country, is there a feeling of dissolution, of hitmazgut, of hitmosesut, as Ra'anan Kolka uses, the terminology he uses. Now, this is a paradigm change that I think we're all trying to come to grips with, or have been so far. Because this is saying something about an internal milieu, an external someone, therapist, outside of that milieu, and that the presence of the other is basically conducive to enabling what will happen within another person. So rather than being about what we say, it's about how we are and who we are. So this is a far cry from ordinary thinking about psychotherapy. It's about being present, and in being present, enabling, inducing, supporting, furthering, inviting what would be the next step in a vital progress within the therapy room, and hopefully then within the other person's, patient's life. So the Zen saying, which goes with this, is Ichigo Ichie, life comes together at this moment, in this meeting. Now, what do we require in order to be that therapist, analyst, humanistic therapist, whatever, who can do that? Be present in a way that enables vitality. Philosopher, phenomenological philosopher, Merleau-Ponty has called the body a body subject. So what we need to be doing in those terms is to turn our body into a body subject. Didier Anzier, writing about le moi peu, skin eager, tells us about the embryonic layers, the layers of the human embryo that divide later into different parts of our physiology. And he tells us, interestingly, that the ectoderm, the outer layer of the embryo, divides into the central nervous system, i.e. the brain, and the skin. So what we conceive of as that which conceptualizes, and what we conceive of as the body in interaction, in tactile interaction with the outside world, stem from a similar source. So we can start thinking about consciousness and the body, mind, and presence in different terms. Wu Guangming, a contemporary Chinese philosopher, calls this a body flowing thinkingly. Zen says, in this respect, consciousness is not a way of clarifying the world by means of thought, but of embodying, realizing what has been understood. And we can start thinking about my patient at the beginning of this presentation in this light. What and how do we embody? So how do we embody? A few years ago, Susie Orbach, a British psychoanalyst, asked at a conference in England, is the baby born with a body? Now, usually we think, is the baby born with a psyche, with a mind? The body is, of course, a given. But as we can see or imagine, the body is not a given. The body has to develop through gaze, sight, handling, touching, maneuvering, coming against, feeling, being felt. So the body is not a given if we are to provide ourselves and our patients with a bodily subject, with a subject body. We need to reinscribe, we need to rewrite, we need to find in ourselves the ability to be fully in body and mind. We need to be there as fully and wholly as we can. So this is not about talking heads. This is not about words being exchanged between one person and another. This is about vitality and presence, and the ability to be present as fully as possible. So, we know from Winnicott there's no such thing as a baby. We know now that there's no such thing as separate body and mind. And we're beginning to see now in this presentation that there are no separate body-minds. One body-mind links with another. Our presence as therapists links with the patient's presence on all levels. Our gaze, our breath, our movements, our pauses, everything is therapy. There's no second of happening between patient and therapist, between these two people. That is not therapy. So rather than a body-mind leap, a leap from the mind to the body, which Golan Shachar has already refuted, there are constant leaps between two body minds. And the question is not about impulse, not about object relations, it's about presence. Now I think that the Western psychotherapy, starting from impulse, sexuality, denied the possibility of presence, or in Professor Lane's terms, of deficit as the main factor dictating prognosis, dictating future, dictating vitality. Consider this now, and a rereading of the famed biblical story. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees in the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I hid myself. So this is not about temptation or Adam and Eve and the serpent. It's about presence. God's ability to be present for man, man's ability to be present in the presence of God. So where is this present consciousness lodged? My first therapist, who was a supervisee of Winnicott's, used to give me a big hug after sessions, saying, today you're more here, you're more present. And through her, I learned something very important that we now know in psychoanalysis. We know that interpretations are not words, interpretations are procedures, procedural interpretations, Herzog calls them. We know that there are enactments, as Ogden tells us. We know that presence induces and conduces vitality. We know from Daniel Stern's Forms of Vitality that vitality is a mode of being that is a movement with a temporal contour and a sense of aliveness going somewhere, a separate kind of experience. Let me start finishing off by another vignette. A few months into therapy, Offer, a key media worker, is recovering from a heart attack. His tension and his sadness are noticeable. As he pauses, his chest relaxes noticeably. With an open heart, he says. We both sink into silence, and for the first time during the session, I noticed the birds outside. You know that feeling when it's... I wonder what they're saying, he all but whispers, as if by joint agreement we had both decided to listen to the birds. What caught my attention was a little pause he made after the word wonder. I suggested that perhaps his sense of wonder had to do not with what the birds are saying, but with how the birds are saying it. Perhaps he sensed that it is with wonder. Perhaps he sensed it is with open heart, I propose. He takes this in, and we both resign to silence. He then says, as if reciting, with open heart, I listen to the birds chirping. With open heart. You just wrote a haiku, I exclaim. We just wrote a haiku, he counters. And I realize we may include both of us, and or an analytic third, and the birds outside. I'd just like to say that this, since these modalities are not usually studied in run-of-the-mill trainings, a lot of people these days go to focusing, somatic experiencing, etc. And I think the challenge would be how to bring words into being what Zen calls live words. Meaning is intrinsic to being, and it's manifest via presence and vitality. The koan of body-mind life, in its reciprocity, its interbeingness, it's never logical, it's always elusive, it persists, thank God. It keeps us present, helping our patients seek and find their aliveness and vitality, their direction, rhythm, and involvement. It is mutative presence and vital action, the action of curing by talking included, that brings about health through a vital engagement and presence in life. Thank you very much.